deep in the moonlit expanse of the Navajo Nation, where the high desert winds howl like grieving spirits, there is a boundary you should never cross and a name you should never whisper. Legend says that among the mesas and the sagebrush, something ancient and malevolent wears the skin of the innocent, watching from the shadows with eyes that reflect a terrifying, inhuman intelligence. We are diving deep into the heart of the Southwest's most bone-chilling mystery, a secret so guarded that many locals refuse to even acknowledge it exists for fear of drawing its gaze. Before we begin this journey into the darkness of the desert, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your location in the comments, but keep your lights on, because once you look into the eyes of a skinwalker, your soul might never belong to you again. The vast, undulating dunes of the Arizona desert stretched out like a sea of pale bone under the oppressive heat of the setting sun, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own as Elias drove his rusted pickup truck toward the remote outskirts of the reservation. He had been warned by the elders in the nearby village to never travel these roads after the sun dipped below the horizon, but Elias was a man of modern science, a surveyor who believed only in what he could measure with a GPS and a transit level. As the sky transitioned from a bruised purple to a suffocating, ink-black void, the silence of the desert became heavy, almost physical, pressing against the glass of his windows until the only sound left was the rhythmic thrumming of his tires against the gravel. He didn't notice the silhouette at first, a distorted, elongated shape crouched near a cluster of jagged rocks, but as his headlights swept across the landscape, he caught a flicker of something impossible, a movement too fluid and too fast to belong to any known predator of the American West. Elias felt a sudden, inexplicable chill prickle the back of his neck, a primal instinctual alarm bell ringing in the depths of his subconscious that told him he was being hunted by something that didn't follow the laws of biology. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as he stared into the darkness ahead, trying to convince himself that the creature he had just glimpsed was merely a coyote or perhaps a stray wolf displaced from the mountains. But the proportions had been all wrong. The limbs were far too long, the joints bending at angles that would have shattered a canine skeleton, and the skin, if it could be called that, shimmered with a greasy, unnatural pallor in the periphery of his high beams. He pushed the accelerator down, the engine groaning in protest as the truck lurched forward, but the feeling of being watched intensified, as if 1,000 invisible eyes were peering out from behind the cacti and the boulders, judging his trespass into a territory where man was never meant to tread. The air inside the cabin suddenly turned frigid, smelling of wet fur and ancient decay, a scent so foul it made Elias gag as he fumbled to roll up his windows despite the lingering heat of the desert night. He checked his rearview mirror and his heart nearly stopped. A pair of glowing, amber orbs were pacing the truck from the brush, moving at 40 miles per hour with a terrifying, effortless grace that defied human comprehension. These weren't the eyes of an animal, which usually reflected a flat, glassy light. These eyes burned with a malevolent, sentient fire, a conscious hatred that seemed to reach out and wrap its cold fingers around Elias's heart. He realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror that he was witnessing the physical manifestation of the Navajo legends he had mocked, the Inalblushii, the one who walks on all fours, a witch who has traded their humanity for the power to shift shapes and inflict misery upon the living. As the road narrowed into a treacherous path flanked by steep canyon walls, the creature surged forward, its form blurring into a horrific composite of man and beast, draped in a tattered, blood-stained pelt that looked like it had been harvested from a dozen different animals. Elias could see the elongated fingers ending in jagged, blackened claws scraping against the side of his truck, the sound of metal on bone screeching through the night like a banshee's wail. The Skinwalker didn't just want to kill him, it wanted to play with him, to savor the exquisite flavor of his mounting panic before it claimed his physical vessel for its own dark purposes. It began to mimic the sounds of the desert, but in a way that was fundamentally broken. The sound of a hawk's cry twisted into a human scream, and then, most chillingly, the sound of Elias's own mother calling his name from the darkness outside, her voice perfect in its inflection but hollow in its soul. Sweat poured down Elias's face as he realized the truck was slowing down, the engine sputtering as if the very presence of the witch was draining the mechanical life from the vehicle, leaving him stranded in the epicenter of a nightmare. He reached for his flashlight, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it, and when the beam cut through the gloom, it landed directly on the creature perched atop a nearby ridge. It stood upright now, a towering, spindly figure with the head of a wolf but the torso of a starved, gray-skinned man, its ribs protruding like knives under its taut, leathery hide. It didn't blink, it simply stared, its wide, unblinking eyes locking onto Elias's through the windshield, and in that moment, he felt a psychic intrusion so violent it felt like his brain was being scraped raw by a rusty blade. The legends were true. To look a skinwalker in the eye was to invite it into your mind, allowing it to see your every fear, your every secret, and the precise location of your breaking point. The truck finally died with a pathetic wheeze, leaving Elias enveloped in a silence so profound it felt like he had been buried alive beneath the desert floor, with only the ticking of the cooling engine to mark the passage of time. Outside, the scratching resumed, but this time it was coming from the roof of the truck, the heavy thuds of something massive shifting its weight above his head, causing the metal to groan and dent inward. He huddled in the center of the seat, clutching a small silver crucifix he had found in the glove box, a relic from a life he had long since abandoned but now clung to as his only shield against the encroaching abyss. Suddenly, the driver's side window shattered into a million glittering shards, and a hand, long, pale, and covered in coarse black hair, reached inside, its fingers questing through the air like blind worms searching for a meal. Elias screamed, a sound of total psychological collapse, as the creature began to whisper in a language that predated the arrival of man, a rhythmic, guttural chanting that made the very air vibrate with the frequency of the grave. Desperation took hold as Elias kicked the passenger door open and scrambled out into the sand, his boots slipping on the loose shale as he sprinted toward a nearby cave entrance he had seen on his maps earlier that day. He could hear the skinwalker behind him, not running, but leaping, the sound of its heavy landings echoing off the canyon walls like the beat of a demonic drum. Every time he glanced back, the creature was closer, its face shifting and undulating in the moonlight, transitioning from a coyote to a mountain lion to a distorted version of Elias himself, a mocking reflection of his own terror. He reached the cave and dove inside, the cool, damp air of the earth offering a momentary reprieve from the suffocating heat of the chase, but he knew he was trapped, a rat in a hole waiting for the predator to decide how it wanted to feast. The shadows at the mouth of the cave began to thicken and coil, taking on a physical weight that blocked out the stars, until only the amber eyes remained, hovering in the entrance. Inside the cavern, the walls were adorned with ancient petroglyphs, depictions of horned figures and twisted spirits that seemed to dance in the flickering light of Elias's dying flashlight, warning of the very evil that now stood at his doorstep. The skinwalker didn't enter immediately, it lingered at the threshold, its breathing heavy and wet, a sound like blood bubbling in a punctured lung, as it waited for the fear to fully ripen within its prey. Elias backed deeper into the darkness, his hands brushing against piles of dry bone, remnants of previous travelers who had ignored the warnings and found themselves at the mercy of the desert's darkest secret. He realized that the creature wasn't just a physical threat, it was a spiritual parasite, a being that fed on the corruption of the soul and the absolute loss of hope, growing stronger with every whimper that escaped Elias's parched throat. He tried to pray, but the words felt like ash in his mouth, the sacred names erased by the sheer, overwhelming presence of the ancient malice standing just a few feet away. The creature began to speak again, but this time it didn't use a voice Elias recognized. It spoke in a chorus of 100 voices, a cacophony of the dead and the damned that vibrated through his very marrow. It told him of the rituals it had performed to shed its humanity, the sacrifices made in the hidden valleys where the sun never shines, and the eternal hunger that drove it to hunt across the centuries. It mocked his science and his skepticism, laughing at the arrogance of a man who thought he could master a land that was old when the stars were young and where the spirits still held dominion. As it stepped into the cave, the light of Elias's flashlight finally failed, plunging him into a total, claustrophobic darkness where the only points of reference were the glowing eyes and the rhythmic clicking of the skinwalker's claws against the stone floor. He felt a cold breath on his cheek, smelling of copper and sage, and a hand gripped his shoulder with the strength of a hydraulic press, pinning him against the cold, unforgiving rock. In the absolute darkness, Elias's other senses heightened to a painful degree, allowing him to feel the texture of the creature's pelt, a coarse, matted mess of fur that felt like it was still twitching with a life of its own. He felt the heat radiating from the skinwalker's body, an intense, unnatural fever that suggested its internal organs were burning with the power of the dark magic that sustained it. The creature leaned in close, its snout, or nose, brushing against his ear, and it whispered a single secret, a truth about Elias's own life that no one else could possibly know, proving that it had already hollowed out his mind. It was then that Elias understood the true horror of the Skinwalker. It didn't just kill you, it became you, stepping into your life, wearing your face, and slowly destroying everything you loved while you watched from the prison of your own stolen skin. The realization broke the last tether of his sanity, and he began to laugh, a high, thin sound that joined the chorus of the desert wind, echoing out of the cave and across the empty mesas. Outside, the desert remained indifferent to the struggle, the moon continuing its slow arc across the sky as the sounds of the struggle within the cave faded into a series of wet, tearing noises followed by a silence more terrifying than any scream. When the sun finally began to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the red rocks and the twisted junipers, a figure emerged from the cave, blinking in the early morning light. It was Elias, or at least, it wore his clothes and possessed his height, his build, and the familiar curve of his jawline, but there was something fundamentally off about the way it moved. His gait was too wide, his arms swinging with a loose, disjointed motion that suggested the bones beneath the skin hadn't quite settled into their new positions yet. He walked back toward the stalled truck, his eyes shielded by a pair of dark sunglasses, though the amber glow beneath the lenses was visible to anyone who dared to look closely enough. He reached the truck and placed a hand on the hood. The engine, which had been dead and cold just hours before, roared to life with a single turn of the key as if the vehicle itself was terrified into obedience. The man who looked like Elias sat behind the wheel, his hands gripping the plastic with a strength that caused the material to crack, his reflection in the rearview mirror shifting for a fraction of a second into something snarling and prehistoric. He drove away from the reservation, heading back toward the city, toward the world of offices and suburban streets, a wolf in surveyor's clothing ready to bring the darkness of the desert into the heart of civilization. Behind him, the wind swept across the mouth of the cave, erasing his footprints and burying the discarded remnants of the real Elias beneath a fresh layer of shifting, treacherous sand. The desert had claimed another soul, and the secret of the Skinwalker remained safe, hidden behind a mask of normalcy that no one would ever think to question until it was far too late. Years passed, and stories began to circulate in Elias's hometown about the man who had returned from the desert changed, a man who never blinked, who spoke in a voice that sounded like several people talking at once, and who was often seen standing motionless in his backyard, staring into the woods for hours at a time. His friends and family noticed that his house always smelled of decay, no matter how much he cleaned, and that his pets had all disappeared within weeks of his return, leaving behind only a sense of lingering dread. They whispered about the way he looked at them, his eyes sometimes flashing with a predatory hunger that made their skin crawl, though they laughed it off as desert madness or a midlife crisis. But those who knew the old legends, the elders who still remembered the songs of protection, stayed far away, recognizing the heavy, stagnant aura of a Skinwalker who had successfully integrated into the herd. They knew that the man named Elias was long gone, and that the thing inhabiting his house was merely a shadow waiting for the right moment to shed its current skin and find a fresh one. The viral nature of the story spread through the local community like a wildfire, fueled by blurry doorbell camera footage of a figure running on all fours through the suburbs at 3 in the morning, moving with a speed that outperformed any Olympic sprinter. People started locking their doors and keeping their children inside, sensing a darkness that had permeated the air, a spiritual rot that seemed to follow in the wake of the man who looked like Elias. Paranormal investigators and YouTubers flocked to the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary creature, but the Skinwalker was patient and cunning, hiding in plain sight and using the skepticism of the modern world as its greatest shield. It knew that as long as people doubted its existence, it could continue its cycle of predation indefinitely, moving from town to town, leaving a trail of broken lives and empty husks in its wake. The desert's darkest secret was no longer confined to the mesas. It was now walking among us, a silent, shifting nightmare that proved the old warnings were never just stories. So, the next time you find yourself driving through the vast, lonely stretches of the American Southwest, and you see a figure standing by the side of the road, or a pair of eyes reflecting the moonlight from the brush, do not stop and do not look them in the eye. Remember the story of Elias and the price he paid for his curiosity and his arrogance in the face of the ancient unknown. The desert is a place of beauty, but it is also a place of profound, predatory power where the lines between man and beast are thinner than a coyote's whisper. If you hear a familiar voice calling your name from the darkness where no one should be, or if you feel a gaze that makes your soul want to shrink away, keep your eyes on the road and keep driving until the sun comes up. Because out there in the sand and the silence, the Skinwalkers are still waiting, and they are always looking for a new skin to wear.